Seven Serpents Audible presents Shadows Rising by Richard A. Knack. Just kidding, it's Madeleine Roux. Prologue, Westfall. Anduin Rin rode as if 1,000 screaming servants of the void followed close at his back, thunder booming above in the sky and crashing below as his horse's hooves beat the ground hard, carrying him across the wounded plains of Westfall. No one but his loyal friend and spymaster chased him, but it didn't matter. Darkness nipped at his heels, and he would do whatever he could to outrun it, at least for the moment. At least for one moment. "Sire! Sire! Damn you, my horse is going to throw a shoe!" Matthias Shaw's voice managed to rise above the rumbling overhead and the din of the horses. Anduin ignored him, clucking his tongue, spurring reverence faster. Faster, faster, faster. He couldn't slow down, not for anything. In the distance, a tower of debris and energy rose like a crystalline spike from the low hills of the farmlands. He couldn't take his eyes away from it as the thickening clouds above rolled closer, casting a shadow over the land. He remembered thinking it impossible that Westfall should change so drastically, but the cataclysm had raged, heedless of a young man's nostalgia. And yet it was as if his own childhood, his own deeply held memories had been rearranged. He was but a boy then, untested. Now he felt owned as a blade. That untested boy had thought certain things remained constant, but now he knew such beliefs to be childish. Nothing was permanent. Any city could crumble, but foes could also become allies, even friends. There was no more wisdom in cynicism than in optimism. "Sire!" He relented at last, pulling gently on Reverence's reins, the magnificent white horse slowing to a canter, allowing the spymaster to gain ground and trot up to his side. "My apologies," Anduin sighed, tossing back the hair that had fallen to his eyes. "That must have been a taxing ride for your old bones." "You didn't tell me this was a race," Shaw grunted. Despite Anduin's teasing, the older man, weathered but still strong and cunning, wasn't even out of breath. "With fair warning, I would leave you crying in the dust, your majesty." "Well," Anduin reined his horse around to face the wall of forest behind them, across the river in Elwyn. "We shall have to put that to the test." "Maybe. But first you're going to tell me why you're riding like a madman today. The last thing we need is you getting thrown and snapping your royal neck." Shaw had a rough way about him, and his voice was equally gruff, as if he gargled with sawdust each morning. But that harsh, forward manner was a comfort to Anduin. While most at court bowed and scraped around in the king's presence, Shaw always gave it to him straight. The clouds overhead bunched and threatened to unleash a downpour, but Anduin ignored the coming rain, jumping down from the saddle with the ease of a practiced rider. Reverence seemed agitated, tossing his great white mane and gnashing his teeth. The king made his way around to the horse's head, taking a few slivers of apple from his pocket and offering it to the beast. His halter's gone crooked. He let the horse lean its warm, soft nose into his shoulder, while he fixed the bit and touched his forehead to the spot between Reverence's eyes. "You know, when I was very young and learning to ride, my father took me to the stables and gave me my first pony, dappled, gentle, 13 hands. I asked my father why horses were measured in hands." Anduin smiled wanly at the distant memory. "He only grinned at me and said he didn't know. Then he barked at the groom asking if he knew. Nobody did. I think the groom probably soiled himself, he was so embarrassed. Poor lad was hardly older than I was. Marvin was his name, I think." Shaw was still in the saddle, his expression suddenly distant. "I didn't know him." But Anduin knew better. knew Shaw was holding something back. He almost certainly had known Marvin, and Marvin had probably died somehow, in one war or another, by an orcish axe or a poisoned forsaken blade. Maybe his house had collapsed in the cataclysm and the ground had swallowed him whole. Anduin pushed the bitter thought aside. I was shocked. My father, the King of Stormwind, had just admitted his own ignorance in front of a servant. I told him as much, and do you know what he said? Shaw shook his head. No. He said, "Only the fool thinks himself an expert in everything. The wise man admits his limitations, and endeavors to know more." They were both silent for a moment, listening to the storm roll its way across the Dagger Hills, moving north toward them. "He wasn't an easy king to serve, but there was satisfaction in the challenge. The same can't be said for all rulers." At that, Anduin winced. Ouch! "Oh, there's satisfaction in service to your crown, too. It's just a bit more of a challenge," Shaw replied with just a hint of a smile. And that was the most the enigmatic spymaster ever gave. "Case in point, you're avoiding my question." "No, Shaw. I was answering it." Anduin held Reverence's reins loosely with his left hand, pointing to the forest with his right, and beyond that, the spires of Stormwind City rising in the misty distance. "I'm acknowledging my limitations. Today was... Anduin groped uselessly for the word. Difficult? That didn't cover it. Disheartening? Vexing? Crushing. Tyrande and Malfurion had fled to Nordrassil, and all of his missives went unread. A messenger had returned that morning with his letter to them unopened. The man looked shaken, more so when Anduin told him firmly to leave, return to Nordrassil, and try again. No matter how much Anduin attempted to console himself that the rift between humans and night elves could be bridged, its mere existence dismayed him. They ought to be united, solid, though he could not begrudge them their anger. Had Stormwind burned to the ground under his rule, he wasn't sure forgiveness would come easily, or ever. A plume of smoke shot up just west of Saldine's farm. An accompanying boom might have been mistaken for thunder, were it not for the distinctive sound of splintering wood and a man's scream that followed. "What was that?" Anduin murmured. He charged off towards the commotion and the smoke, with Shaw grumbling behind him. "Caution," the old spy said. "It could be an ambush." "These are my people, my lands, and your enemies would use that against you." But Anduin had heard anguish in the cry from the barn, and he couldn't stand by helplessly while one of his subjects suffered. They reached an open field, the hay gathered and formed into rounds as high as a man. Chickens scattered at their approach, and Anduin and Shaw used a gap in the broken fence to enter the field, leaving their horses with the reins looped around the jagged posts. "Could it have been an explosion? I hope nobody is injured." Anduin quickened his pace, raised voices growing clearer and more numerous as he and Shaw were enveloped by the changing wind and, with it, the choking smoke. Anduin batted at it, squinting ahead to see what remained of the barn roof, collapsed in on itself with 3 men in a heated argument. One fellow, the tallest, was dressed in little but rags, his hair matted and dirty, debris from the explosion hanging in his beard. The other men wore the simple homespun garb of farmers, patched and pricked with grass, their faces weathered from their labor. "You go, you miserable half-wit! I said you could shelter my barn, not use it for your mad experiments!" Closer, and with the smoke dissipating, Anduin could tell that the 2 farmers were related, one father and one son, the latter his parent in miniature, with even the same ruddy beard, just with less grey shot through it. The old farmer lunged at Yago, fists balled and at the ready. He stopped at the unmistakable sound of steel being unsheathed. Spinning, he was met not with a blade itself, but simply Matthias Shaw's stony face. The sword never came free of its scabbard. The suggestion that it might was enough to give the farmers pause. "Gentlemen," Anduin said softly, putting up his hands, "is there a problem here?"
"He's no gentleman," the farmer bellowed. "He's a lousy drunk using my barn to brew bedevilled moonshine. Look at my roof. How am I to afford the repairs?"
It took him a moment to realize whom he was addressing, but he only made the most meagre attempt to bow his head with respect. His son, by contrast, went white as a sheet. "I would have his side of the story, too," Anduin replied. He turned toward Yago, whose only response was to spit loudly and wetly on the ground at the king's feet. Just that much made the man nearly topple over, and his hiccup could have been heard all the way back in Stormwind Keep. The smell of burned wood and burned moonshine wasn't enough to cover up the telltale sour ale stench on his breath.
"There,"
Yago slurred, pointing at his own dry spittle.
"That's all my side of the story is worth. That's all I've left in the world. Me bones, me blood, me bile. Nothing. I've nothing."
His eyes flared wide for an instant, his face turning red through the soot coating his face.
"Nothing!"
He sprang at Anduin clumsily, but even so, Shaw was there to intercept him. Like a flash, the spymaster leapt in front of the king, keeping his weapon half-sheathed, his hand clamping down on the drunkard's shoulder.
"I wouldn't," Shaw growled. "Do it! Use that sword of yours!"
Yago sputtered. Over Shaw's shoulder, Anduin met the man's tear-swollen, bloodshot eyes. The more he looked at him, the more he seemed somewhat familiar.
I was there when the Forsaken Queen turned on her own."
Anduin froze, watching as Yago's legs turned liquid beneath him, and he slumped down to the ground, the blackened motes on the air settling around him like a blackened snow.
"Arathi, I went. I was there. My Wilmer, he was there, and he was changed. One of them, all rotten and strange, but still Wilmer, still the best man I ever knew and loved."
Yago's rage took him again, and he snarled, jabbing a finger up at Anduin.
"You could have stopped her. You could have saved them."
Shaw carefully lowered Yago's hand. "That is not how you address your king."
"My king? My king!"
Yago laughed, high-pitched and half-mad.
"Not my king. King of fools, maybe."
Anduin forced his voice to be steady, and moved the spymaster aside. "It's all right, Shaw." Then he knelt, disguising the quivering he felt in his knees. The shame he still felt about that day, about that failure. He had gone to the Arathi Highlands in good faith to try and mend the rift between those who had become forsaken, undead, and the human family members they had left behind. The talks had gone well, until they hadn't. The Queen of the Forsaken, Sylvanas Windrunner, now the most hunted person on Azeroth, had killed her own people, executing any of her kind who chose to reunite and stay with their human loved ones. "I'm sorry, Yago. Yago pushed him aside, hard, then managed to climb to his feet and run a few paces out into the field. Swiftly, Shaw turned to apprehend him, but there was no need. Yago fell face down in the dirt, arms splayed out to his sides, and he had managed to fall inches from the pointed leather boot of Illyria Windrunner. Anduin had not heard her approach, and no horse waited beside her, but the ranger had more creative ways of traveling anyway. She nudged the fallen man with her boot and shrugged. "Still breathing."
"That's a relief,"
the farmer muttered dryly. Anduin rose and walked resolutely toward Illyria, while the farmer detained Shaw, complaining about his ruined roof.
"Just how am I to pay for this? Iago doesn't have a copper to his name."
"Speak with Captain Dunuvin," Shaw was telling him coolly. "He can lend you some of the garrison boys to see to the damage."
"Sure,"
the farmer grunted.
"I'll bet he will."
Anduin stopped a hair's width from Iago's feet, staring at Illyria over the man's toppled body. "You're early," he said, breathless. He didn't intend to ignore the issue at hand. Iago mattered, of course. Every subject in his kingdom mattered. But Illyria's appearance had everything to do with Iago's pain. Illyria had been sent on the most urgent of missions, to find Sylvanas Windrunner. But the king had not expected her so soon. Wilmer was just one of Sylvanas's innumerable crimes, and the murderess responsible for his death was to be found and brought to justice. Anduin took Illyria by the arm, leading her away from the field and back toward their restless horses. "Is early a good sign?" he pressed. Illyria Windrunner's delicate, pale face was half hidden by her hood, but even so, Anduin read only disappointment on the taut line of her lips. She kept her eyes down on the ground as they walked, her body tellingly rigid. "No," Illyria whispered. Just that one word, and her voice cracked with emotion. She looked tired, drawn, dark smudges making her void-touched eyes all the brighter. "No, my king, I have no good news for you this day." They had reached the fences. Anduin grasped one of the crossbeams and squeezed, the old battered wood creaking. He wanted to break it. He wanted it to snap. A surge of anger made him close his eyes, as if he were afraid of what Illyria might see in there. "My sister is not some slovenly boar bumbling across the open plains," Illyria continued, drawing back from him and crossing her arms over the green and gold cuirass beneath her cloak. "She is cunning, and using all of her dark power to conceal herself." "And you are the finest hunter I know," Anduin said through clenched teeth. "And not one I expected to fail. You know her best, Illyria. You were our greatest hope." Shaw joined them silently, his gaze trained on the Void Elf. For a moment, none of them spoke, the storm speeding toward the grasslands, whipping the winds into a frenzy. A small herd of gore-tusks screeched in alarm and galloped away from the fields. A griffin soared overhead, destined for Sentinel Hill. The wood was still creaking in Anduin's grasp, it shuddered in his palm, and still he wanted it to snap. It would feel cathartic to break something. They had overcome the Legion, the terror of Sargeras raining fire and doom upon their world. Yet they had persevered. How many had fallen to that same Legion? How many minds had been corrupted and shredded into ribbons by madness of N'Zoth? Yet even an old god fell to their strength. But one woman evaded justice. It seemed like such a small thing to find her, and yet it was proving a costly, perhaps impossible task. "We will keep trying," Illyria said with mollifying confidence. "She cannot hide forever. Soon enough she will have to show herself, and when she does, she will have the full might of her enemies bearing down upon her." Anduin opened his eyes slowly, turning his head toward the blonde elf, and as their eyes met he felt a jolt, an unpleasant whisper from the dark recesses of his memory. Once Illyria had suggested to him that Sylvanas faced N'Zoth. She and her sister Verisa had been convinced it was the wisest course of action. To Anduin the request seemed absurd. It still did. Blood was blood, of course, and they had every right to believe in their sister's prowess, but why not let their most pressing threat fight yet another pressing threat? Anduin had refused. Her power was not in question, but now... He thought perhaps Shaw had said his name, but he felt lost to the dark power of that memory. Why had Illyria asked such a thing of him? How could she be so blind as to extend a chance, any chance, to someone as treacherous as Sylvanas Windrunner? And now she had failed in her one explicit task to track her sister and help him bring her to justice. Maybe she was hiding something. Maybe the cold glow of her eyes concealed more than just the boundless mysteries of the void. How could he be certain of Illyria's loyalty? Was it a risk, a foolish, reckless risk to keep her at his side? A foolish, reckless risk, just like trusting Sylvanas in the Arathi Highlands, when a naive boy-king had believed the words of a snake. No. Illyria had proved herself many times, and she spoke true. Sylvanas was no simple quarry. The hunt would continue, and he, as king, would find a way to keep faith in their odds of victory. That was his duty. A man had to know his limits, but he could not reach that limit, not yet. Too many depended on him now. The fence beam snapped. Just another thing to fix. Another in a long, long line of things to mend. Come, he said quietly, turning his back on them both. The gale is nearly upon us. Let us return to Stormwind and decide our next approach. Sylvanas will not rest, and so neither will we. Chapter 1. Orgrimmar. Much as it surprised him, the dry heat and endless noise of Orgrimmar felt like home. Perhaps it was like returning to a wayward, peculiar family, one Thrall had not necessarily chosen, but that he had come to respect. Thrall, son of Durotan, former war chief, had expected to recoil at the familiar scents and mayhem of the Horde city, but he slipped back into his rhythm with surprising ease. In a way, the familiarity of it frightened him. Things had changed, of course. The Horde itself had changed. It had to. No longer could a single war chief rule them all. No, like a strange family, the Horde had grown, suffered, expanded, retracted, and finally, he thought, they were beginning to find their feet, not as different nations united by a single voice, but as a chorus of strong voices raised as one. Wolves grew stronger as a pack, in numbers, and there in Gromash Hold, among the Horde Council, he saw many fine wolves at his side. Do not fear this, he thought, gazing around at those assembled. You lead no one, you simply sit among equals. His pride did not chafe at the thought. In fact, he welcomed it. Thrall placed his hand on his knees, leaning forward as the two young Tauren braves giving report in the center of the rotunda finished recalling their tale. They had sighted 2 Dark Ranger spies on a ridge in the northern Barrens, and after alerting a senior patrol in the area, the Rangers were tracked and captured. The spies had swallowed some foul concoction and died before they could be questioned, but still, they would no longer be allowed to be the Dark Lady's eyes in Durotar. A smattering of applause went around the room, and the 2 braves stood tall, puffing out their furred chests and holding their spears straight. Thrall couldn't stop himself from wondering how long they would live. What cold, bleak place far from here would be their end? What families they would leave behind as they gave themselves over to as grist to the mill of war? No. They were putting a stop to all that. That was the purpose of the council, to eschew the bloody whims of one in favor of more tempered policies. And while many still flinched at the mere mention of the armistice, Thrall thought it a reprieve the Horde sorely needed. Well done, Lorthamar Theron called to the 2 braves. The leader of the Blood Elves, with his long, pale hair, scarred and dead left eye, and painstakingly groomed beard, raised a chalice. Bravely done. A toast to these fine soldiers of the Horde. Loktar! Loktar! Thrall raised his own cup. but his eyes fell on an empty seat beside the crimson-clad leader of the Blood Elves. Other pairs of eyes and Lorthamar's good one had wandered to that spot throughout the afternoon. It seemed almost too ironic. Here they were, a council in response to Sylvanas Windrunner's controversial leadership and self-exile, and nobody sat in her place to speak for the Forsaken. Even the new queen of Zandalar, Talanji, had come from her far-off nation to meet with the council. She sat almost exactly across from Thrall, in the circle of chairs making up the council in the hold, and she had said little so far, something, he knew, that was uncharacteristic of the brash young queen. Beside her, nearest to the entrance, sat the also newly risen trade prince of the Bilgewater cartel, and while Gazlo might have been diminutive in size, he had made his larger-than-life presence known throughout the day's reports, discussions, and disagreements. The goblin had just poured himself more ale when two figures burst through the open archway, startling the Tauren Braves and Gazlo. Their conspicuously missing council member had at last appeared. A slight, blue-eyed undead woman ran breathlessly into the hold, her gaze flicking in every direction, her posture suggesting she was not at all sorry for their tardiness. Behind her, a ghostly pale woman, also undead, stood with far more poise. They could not have been any more different, the two ladies, one ravaged by her affliction to the bones, the other smooth and unblemished, glowing from within with an arresting light. Lillian Voss, interim leader of the Forsaken, and Kalia Menethil had arrived, stealing the attention of every breathing creature in the hold, and leaving the two reporting braves to shift awkwardly in the sudden silence. Kalia seemed to be watching Lillian's every move, as if she might be tested on it later. Finally, Bane Bloodhoof gestured for them to step away, and the two Tauren shuffled toward him, kneeling on the floor behind their high chieftain. Nobody spoke, and nobody seemed to know what to say, least of all the new arrivals. Lillian Voss adjusted the worn pack on her shoulder, her boots, greaves, and cloak spattered with fresh mud. To Thrall's right, the white-haired and white-tattooed First Arcanist Thalisra coughed delicately into her fist. "I am not their leader." The silence stretched painfully on. Thrall stood and opened his arms wide to the newcomers, conjuring a warm smile. "Your absence was keenly felt," Thrall boomed. "The Horde is not the Horde without the Forsaken." Lillian nodded, biting down so hard on her lower lip that Thrall worried she would break the skin. Her companion, the luminous Kalia Menethil in priestly garb, glided forward, inclining her silver head toward him. "Graciously said." "Join us, please." Thrall returned to his seat and indicated the open set of high-backed chairs reserved for their party. "You will find Orgrimmar's finest foods and all the wine or mead you can... we are at your disposal," the Volpera Kiro said, paws washing over one another after the mistake. They were new to the Horde, after all. More softly he added, "Please take a seat." The gaff broke the tension, and Gazlo got a good chuckle out of the tawny Volpera's misstep. The undead had no need of food or drink, and Thrall was glad to find their new Forsaken leadership did not take offense. Instead, they were welcomed by the immense and feather-bedecked Bane Bloodhoof and Lorthamar, sitting on either side of the empty chairs. "May we ask what detained you?" Lorthamar inquired as the ladies were seated. "Our people can't stay in Orgrimmar forever," Lillian replied, at last finding her tongue. Once she had sat down and unburdened herself of her pack, she appeared more at ease. Her blue eyes flashed brighter as she straightened her back and removed her leather cloak. "It's too hot. We prefer the shadows and the damp. Perhaps in time the ruins of Lordaeron can be reclaimed, and our home there restored. Things are a little less heated with the armistice, but that doesn't mean Alliance ships are happy to see our flags at sea." Across from them, sharpening a knife beside the trade prince, the dark-spear troll Rokan hissed and leapt to his feet. His tusks gleamed as readily as his daggers. "They give you trouble?" "We took the long way around," Lillian rasped.
added a few days to our journey. Better to be careful in these tense times, Kalia added softly, lest we cause a diplomatic incident.
Then she shrugged, weary, and removed her sun-faded blue shawl, folding it neatly.
I'm sure if we were intercepted, Derek Proudmoore could intervene on our—
The Proudmoores can do nothing for us.
Just when Thrall felt the thrum of nerves in the room dissipating, the young Zandalari queen was on her feet, icily rigid. Talanji slashed her hand through the air, her many golden piercings twinkling softly as she did. Her tall, jewel-encrusted headdress casting a looming shadow that reached across the hold and flickered in the firelight. Leather squeaked and iron jangled as the murmurs and shifting began. Behind him, Thrall heard his page, Zekhan, blow out a long breath.
The Horde could not stop the attack on Zandalar, a failure I took in stride, believing that when we had recovered, we could take the fight to the Alliance, to the Proudmoores.
Talanji continued, her voice shaking with emotion.
Peace with the Alliance means peace with the Proudmoores, with Jaina. I was foolish to believe my people would have their revenge.
Thrall squeezed the bridge of his nose, and it had all been going so smoothly. Perhaps he should have expected this. They were all so different, these assembled leaders, with conflicting ideas on what it meant to be part of the Horde, and no doubt their visions of the future varied as well. The tide of uneasy voices in the room began to crest. Before he could offer something mollifying to the new queen, Lillian was quick to respond.
Derek is one of us now. You will have to accept that.
Talanji snarled, taking a single menacing step toward the Forsaken leader.
I have nothing to accept. You need me, and I had thought we had need for the Horde. Now I see you will not help us seek justice for the siege of Zuldazar.
Without blinking, Lillian stood up, poking a bony finger in the troll's direction.
Zandalari justice is not the only justice that matters. The Forsaken have been cast aside, spat on, and ignored for long enough. Derek is Forsaken, and the Forsaken are the Horde.
A smattering of agreeing noises traveled around the hold.
Are the Zandalari not the Horde?
Talanji replied hotly. It was her time to hold court, apparently, and she strode to the center of the room, raising her voice above the many muted discussions that had broken out.
Where is the Horde response? Where is the support for my people? When will you acknowledge our wounds?
If we act rashly, then we endanger the armistice,
the Nightborn Arcanist Thalystra interjected, wisely in Thrall's opinion. She sat calmly with one calf resting on her knee, her hands propped gracefully on her thigh, as she observed Queen Talanji and Lillian Voss inching closer to blows. Our resources are stretched thin as it is, Lorthamar put in reasonably. We must be thoughtful if we are to commit our navy to your struggles. Perhaps diplomacy is the answer here, and delegation could be dispatched to Kultiras to—
Delegation? Diplomacy?
Rokan thundered, shaking his head.
Pah! My ancestors be weeping to hear this cowardly talk in Gromash Hold.
At that, the Maghar orcs clustered next to the Darkspears grabbed their weapons and slammed the pommels on the ground in agreement. One managed to raise his voice even above Rokan's protests.
There! Talanji pointed to Rokan. At least there is still one among you who has not been left toothless by this talk of peace.
We all have our grievances, Bane Bloodhoof reminded her. But those must be weighed against the interest of the Horde now. It is not easy, Your Highness. Nobody thought it would be. In time, we can seek to right the wrongs done to the Zandalari.
In time, she whispered, aghast.
It was then that Thrall realized he was one of the few left sitting. The room erupted into splintered arguments, fragments of those long, simmering grievances reaching him, as he locked eyes first with Bane Bloodhoof, and then Lorthamar. Leader or not, it seemed the unpleasant task of restoring order would fall to him. Bane had tried his best, but he required solidarity. Thrall stood,
then Bane, then Lorthamar, finally Thalysra. Each of them silent, and it took only a moment for the others to notice. One by one, the voices died down, until all gazes turned toward them. Before Thrall could call for quiet, Talanji stormed out of the assembly, her bodyguards scrambling to keep pace, making nervous, half-apologetic bows to Thrall as they fled after her.
"Perfect," he said with a sigh. "Meeting adjourned. We will eat and drink and come together again."
"If we can come together," he added silently. It was a warning wrapped in silk, but it was not misheard. Sheepish eyes slid away from him as he cut a path through the leaders and their entourages, the crowd parting silently for him as he made for the door. He was not yet an old orc, but each one of those steps through the hold intensified the exhaustion settling in his bones. What had he agreed to? He pinched his nose again, warding off the searing headache brewing at the base of his skull. Physical brawls left him feeling less bruised. The sense of prairie grass and churned earth carried on the hot afternoon sun flooded him with memories. He blinked his way into the brightness outside, shielding his eyes, remembering a moment not long ago when he stood with the same smells blowing around him, high above the scooped valley of Mulgore, perched on the cliffs of Thunderbluff. Jaina Proudmoore, Talanji's nemesis, had stood before him, assuring him that a fragile alliance between them was worth the blood and strife it would surely cost.
"Horde, alliance," he had said to her. "We've come to this crossroad again and again, Jaina. It always falls apart. What's different this time?"
Her hand had lain softly on his arm, and perhaps more than her words, that one simple gesture moved him. "We are." Thrall had believed her, but now he wasn't so sure, with his head being split in two by the council's argument ringing in his ears. A haze of dust over Orgrimmar dulled the relentless sun. Ceremonial torches outlined a smoky trail out of Gromash Hold, and toward a dozen or so feasting tables, laid out beneath makeshift red tents, painted with the Horde emblem. Predictably, a crowd of curious onlookers waited outside the hold, filling the valley with their curious whispers and gasps of interest as the other council members filed out behind them. There was a festive spirit in the air, drums and flutes, pennants shaped like winged horned wind riders, flapping at the ends of sticks held by eager toddlers' fists. Parents had pressed their children up close to the perimeter of the tents, and some little ones had been hoisted onto shoulders. Thrall stood for a moment with the sunshine warming his bare shoulders, and smiled ruefully at one or two young orcs, each balancing on one of their father's shoulders. As he waved to them, Zekhan ambled up to his side. Lorthamar drifted by with First Arcanist Thalysra at his side, listening rapt as she extolled the virtues of the fine Nightborn wine she had secured for the feast.
"What is it?"
Thrall asked. He could always tell when the brave young troll shaman had something on his mind. The boy was good for a lot of things, but hiding his emotions was not one of them. "There's a message from the Earthen Ring here," Zekhan told him. The other council members overtook them, making their slow procession toward the feasting tents. Lorthamar took his time, basking in the adulation and interest of the crowd.
"I said it was feast time," he growled.
"You'll be wanting to hear this." Thrall had known during his time as war chief that what now could in fact become a perpetual state of being. Turning away from the crowd, he found himself standing before a grey-faced old orc, pockmarked and bearded, with a scar slashed through his lips.
"Yuka,"
Thrall said. This was no mere messenger. He recognized the shaman at once. They had served together against the Legion, and anything that might drive Yuka from his post in the Maelstrom was dire indeed.
"Thrumka, old friend, what brings you to Orgrimmar?"
They clapped hands on each other's shoulders, and Yuka chewed his cheek for a moment before drawing a deep, sorrowful breath.
"The spirits, Thrall. They are in disarray. Where once we communed peacefully with the ancestors, we now find them angry and vengeful. They lash out. They deny us our wisdom. My friend, something is terribly wrong.
Yuka shifted his carved staff to the other hand nervously. It was not like the battle and time-tested seer to fidget so.
When?
Thrall asked in a low voice, keeping the conversation strictly between them. Zekhan sensed he was not invited to the discussion, and took himself a polite distance away.
I came with all speed, Yuka replied. The journey is unforgiving on my body now, but I knew you would listen to me, old friend.
Of course. You were never one to jostle your bones for less than the end of the world, Thrall teased. But they only spared the shortest, driest laugh together.
You jest, but I've never seen such unrest in the spirit world before, and you know how many long, long winters I have seen.
Thrall nodded, his hand still resting firmly on the shaman's upper arm. I have heard you, Yuka. The council will know of this, and I will see to it personally that your concerns are not ignored. That drew a relieved smile across the orc's wrinkled face.
Haste, son of Durotan, haste. The ancestors cry out, and we must listen.
Chapter 2, which takes place in Nazmir. We thought we'd gotten away from it. Apari clasped her hands together under her chin, watching the last drop of life seep out of poor Seshi's eyes. No, not poor Seshi, foolish Seshi. The old wound in Apari's leg throbbed, but she ignored it. Her work was too important. You chose death, she told him softly, when you chose her.
Which?
His last ragged word echoed for a moment in the damp cave. It sounded as if the Loa of Death himself had torn the cry from the troll's throat. The troll's blue eyes flashed bright with desperation one last time, and then went blank. His stare fixing on a point somewhere over Apari's shoulder. On her other shoulder, a hungry dread-tick sat hunched and eager, its sharp little mouth sucking at the air, no doubt tasting death. Not this one, Daz, Apari warned the tick. One sip of his blood, and you'll be flat as a coin, all your insides on the outside. Wretchweed, common as clouds in the primal wetlands. Seshi lay dead on a large stone slab, all that remained of a column from the Zul'Jan ruins to the east. A harsh, foul smell emanated from the body already, his purplish skin shriveled up and sagging, as if he were a dried fruit. Fluid dribbled steadily from the stone slab, joining the soft drip, drop, drip of water from cracks in the cave's ceiling. The constant drumming of the waterfall concealing the cave's mouth distorted for a moment, and then Apari heard the nearly imperceptible footfalls of her most trusted general. This is how it will be? Tayo asked. She joined Apari next to the corpse and wrinkled her nose. A huge slice of bone pierced her septum, her elongated tusks capped with sharpened gold points. Mud and black paint made her long ponytail look like a tar spill. Tayo had been a loyal friend and lieutenant since Yasma's attempt at a coup. Her family had been sympathetic to the spy mistress's ideas, and subsequently banished by Talanji, threatened with execution if they returned. This is how the traitor queen will die? Wretchweed and riverbud root, Apari told her, holding up a small satchel of powder. My own creation. A purge to remove the rot at the heart of our great land, sister. Apari knew her weeds and herbs, her poultices and powders. After receiving a grievous injury to her leg, she had tried everything to relieve the pain, the swelling, and then the infected smell. Nothing worked. It seethed and reeked on until at last she had accepted that, like many scars and betrayals in her life, it would simply have to become another reminder of all that she had lost. In the jungle villages of Zuldazar, wretchweed was everywhere, and healers used it as a purge whenever a child swallowed something poisonous. The right quantity helped, but when dried, powdered, and mixed with riverbud root, wretchweed became lethal. And it was not a gentle way to pass on to the other side. Tayo nodded. She deserves to suffer. Where will it be done? Apari turned and regarded her general. It was a far more pleasant sight than the desiccated mess on the stone slab. Before the whole of her precious horde, she has chosen them over her own people. Now let her die among them. Ancestors be willing. Ancestors be willing, Tayo echoed, making a fist and touching it to her enameled harness. 2 leather bandoliers crisscrossed her chest, packed with brightly feathered poison darts. There is more. The Pale Rider is here. He arrived with an unliving elf. They be anxious to speak with you. The body behind her let out a hiss of air, and Apari twisted, watching the muscle in the troll's shoulders and chest contort. Black bile flowed freely from between his cracked lips. She imagined that same thick ooze pouring out from Talanji's mouth, her bright eyes dim and hollow. Wretchweed purged the sickness in one's body, but this went far beyond sickness, far beyond one troll's death. Talanji was a symbol of everything corrupting the Zandalari Empire, her reign no more than a stain on their ancient and powerful legacy. She only wished she could be there to watch the traitor queen claw at her own throat in fruitless desperation. Apari? She nodded once, and Tayo returned to the entrance of the cave, with its curtain of a waterfall. Daz squirmed on her shoulder, hungry. Outside, beyond the cascade of water and shadows that hid them, a herd of sorrelisks grunted and shrieked at a passing threat. Go, Apari said quietly. Hunt. The tick fluttered its grey wings and scratched at her shoulder, then glided away toward the water sheeting down from above. Apari watched Daz go, the sun glinting against the waterfall, a kaleidoscope of colors flashing so swiftly it might have been her imagination. But no, the rainbow remained etched in her vision, turning the shadows purple and blue. A good omen. Daz soared like a child's ball toward the sunlight, his soft wings just grazing the top of the man's head. So, they had come. She shivered. Things were in motion now, truly in motion. And Apari felt suddenly alive. It seemed like years, an age, since she had experienced such excitement. Apari folded her hands together, the heavy rings there clacking as she limped toward their guests. The man, dark of hair and red of eye, brushed with annoyance at the tick, then pulled at the collar of his thick black coat. Tayo towered a head taller than he, of near equal height to his armored companion. Pale Rider, Apari called out to him. You are welcome here, but in 2 hours we depart. We do not stay long, and the sun never sets twice on our camps. A wise precaution. His bright gaze swept the cave, landing on the grisly sight behind her. He simply smirked. We have come to discuss our arrangement. Might we speak elsewhere, or is this what passes for courtesy in your swamp? No, Apari replied. She inclined her head with respect, but did not bow. Apari no longer bowed to anyone. Not courtesy, but a promise. The man arched one black brow, and the elf to his right sighed with impatience. Her pink skin, veined and mottled, was as sickly as a sky terror's webbing. She held a strange winged helmet under one arm, and Apari wondered just how she could fight smothered in so much heavy armor. But she did not wonder if the elf was dangerous. The murderous glint in her eye transcended culture and custom.
"A promise,"
Apari reiterated, answering the dead man's silent question.
"A vow to my mother, who drank the venom of Shadra, and to all of Zandalar, who deserve better than a crown and gods who care not for them."
She pulled a green stalk of wretchweed from her pocket and held it up, twisting it in the light.
"Shadra is gone. Yasma is gone too. But poison lingers. Poison in my heart," she murmured. "And soon poison in the traitor queen's veins."
Zekhan had not avoided the unforgiving boot of war by staying still. No, he had learned to make himself useful, to stay useful, and to know when that usefulness had come to its end. He had not landed on Varrock Sorfang's side on the battlements of Lordaeron by twiddling his thumbs or taking a nap. And so he did not stand still while his commander descended into a quiet, intense exchange with the Earthen Ring shaman. He casually fell into step behind the tall and well-armed leader of the Darkspear trolls, Roux, using his shadow as a concealment of sorts, ignoring the screams and cheers of the crowd as the assembled council members and their assorted bodyguards, advisors, and hanger-ons retreated to the tempting shade of the feast tents. Zekhan wasn't foolish enough to think those celebratory cheers were for him. No, he was in a shadow, and was a shadow. First his father's, then Sorfang's, and now Thrall's. And as a shadow he crept along, looking for something interesting enough to occupy his time. "Keep your hands busy and your mind sharp," his father Hekazi had told him, when Zekhan was still knee-high to a raptor. "And you will never want for work nor amusement." Work and amusement would have to go hand in hand that day. A drum circle with a trio of wild dancers had been set up outside the tents to welcome the esteemed guests. He watched the goblin, Gazlo, sidle up towards the drums, doing a silly two-step and making the dancers laugh. The music, the steady, infectious rhythm of it, gradually spread to the others approaching the tent, tense shoulders moving instead to the beat, narrowed eyes widening with appreciation at the talented, and scantily dressed, dancers. Only Talanji and her Zandalari contingent stood apart, the detached detachment. He wasn't exactly surprised. While the Horde Council had welcomed her and her folk warmly, her response had so far been nothing but chilly. Zekhan had kept a close eye on her, intrigued and, admittedly, a little besotted with the beautiful queen. She had the most delicate tusks and arresting blue eyes. She also quite clearly had a temper. Talanji paced back and forth on the far southern end of the feast tables, a turquoise-skinned, yellow-haired young troll girl fanning the queen with a massive palm frond. Annoyed with the little puffs of wind, Talanji batted at the girl, shooing her away. Zekhan frowned. Had there not been more bodyguards with Talanji when they arrived? Or had one of her handmaidens gone missing? Orgrimmar was not the most confusing city to navigate in the world, but perhaps one of the Zandalari had gotten lost on their way to the meeting that afternoon. Maybe, he thought. Maybe. He sidled closer, sensing an opportunity. The Horde needed every advantage it could get, and that meant securing Talanji's allegiance anew, an ally willing to join them in war or peace, one willing to provide troops, one willing to join the council. So far, she didn't seem very impressed.
"Might I be of service, your majesty?"
Zekhan gave a low bow and brought out his most dazzling smile. The girl fanning the queen made a tiny sound of alarm. The queen herself stared at him, through him, then rolled her eyes.
"And how could you possibly be of service?"
Her keen eyes, no doubt, took in his humble garments and dirt under his fingernails. Meanwhile, she and her servants glittered like firebugs at dusk. "Your entourage be looking a little light. If ye need an errand run or a fresh cup of wine." Talanji tilted her head to the side, her earrings jangling softly as she interrupted him. "You are spying on me now?" Not the response he was hoping for. Zekhan backed away, already bracing for the lecture Thrall would give him for bothering the queen. He threw up his arms as if in surrender, a cold shiver overcoming him, like someone had traced the tip of a knife down his spine. And then he fell backward, steady 1 minute and flailing the next, his elbow smashing into something hard and then wet, a goblet. Talanji's missing servant had returned, and Zekhan had crashed right into him. The cup and its contents fell to the ground, splashing wine all over Zekhan's feet and the hem of Talanji's gown. "Mind yourself!" the servant carrying the tray and goblet shouted, scrambling to scoop up the fallen goblet. He was older than Talanji, the servant, with scars crisscrossing his nose and a visible sheen of sweat over his brow. "Clumsy oaf! That was the queen's wine!" "Just a mistake," Talanji said, calmly lifting her skirt to inspect the damage. "He meant no harm." But Zekhan stopped listening to the queen, staring at the stain on the fine white silk of her dress. First Arcanist Thalysra's silken voice was suddenly in his head. "I cannot wait for you to sample our arc fruit sangria, Lord Thamar. We have generously arranged enough for all of Orgrimmar to enjoy." The ugly splotch on the queen's hem was purplish blue and turning black. What's more, the puddle left behind on the dirt smelled distinctly of death. "Another cup, Your Majesty, I will return," the servant was saying, bowing to Talanji as he shuffled away. "No!" Zekhan knelt and swept his fingers through the spill on the ground, then sniffed. Whatever it wasn't wine. An herbal tea, maybe, or something worse. "What you be serving her?" Wine," the servant stammered, but the sweat on the troll's brow poured heavy down his temples. "Just wine?" Standing, Zekhan had barely enough time to wedge himself between Talanji and the scarred servant, who yanked a dagger from under his tunic and lunged toward the queen. The commotion had aroused the interest of the entire council, and now Zekhan felt the feasting tents explode into chaos around him. The drums went silent, followed by hushed whispers from the crowd outside. "Back!" Zekhan thundered at Talanji. "Behind me!" A throwing axe flew straight over Zekhan's shoulder, close enough to give him a haircut. He shook it off, hurling a fork of lightning right after the axe. The bolt slammed the servant into a tent pole before he slumped to the ground, the throwing axe buried in the ground beside him. A narrow miss. Thrall's heavy tread came next, and then his intimidating shadow as he raced by them and towards the assassin. That explained the axe. "Hold him!" someone was shouting. "Protect the queen!" Zekhan came to his senses and stumbled after Thrall, who reached the assailant a moment too late. The dagger was still in the troll's hand and swiftly put to use, jammed into his own stomach and yanked upward. "Speak!" Thrall had the troll by his neck, but the dagger had done its gruesome work. "Who sent you? Who sent you?" The old scarred troll had just enough left in him to whisper a final threat. "She will know our bite." Then his head went loose on his neck, a trickle of blood seeping from between withered lips. No sooner had the troll spoken his last than Talanji was upon them, pushing Thrall and Zekhan aside and kneeling on the blood-soaked earth beside the assassin. "He is Zandalari, one of my own. But how?" "All of your people must be held and questioned," Thrall replied sternly. "There is never just one assassin." "Question your own people!" Talanji fumed, leaping to her feet, her hands and gown covered in blood, covered in poison. "We will return home before more blood can be spilled." Thrall sighed and shifted, standing in her way. "I assure you..." "You can assure me nothing. Not ships, not soldiers, not my own personal safety." She straightened her head, and at her height she could easily look Thrall in the eye.
Zekhan cowered, the tension around them thicker than tar. "You do not need me here. Zandalar, my home, will always need me, so that is where I will be." All eyes followed the Zandalari queen as she gathered her small entourage and marched out of the tents, head held high and proud. All eyes, Zekhan noted, except for those belonging to Thrall. It had all happened in the space of a blink. The assassin, the axe, the queen's outrage. He couldn't help but fixate on the moment when his arm knocked the cup out of the assassin's hand. He felt certain his feet had been firmly planted on the ground, that something or someone had shoved him back into the Zandalari. The council members came one by one, drawn by the commotion. The dark spear chieftain Roux appearing at his side, only then sheathing his daggers. Smirking, the taller troll clapped Zekhan on the back, and Zekhan was just dizzy enough from this chaos to sway a little bit from the force of it.
"Ya did good, boy. Those be the reflexes of Kimball."
"But I didn't do it." The lightning he could take credit for, but the cup? The cup! He frowned, gazing around at the faces of relieved council members. Only Thrall, visible at the back of the crowd, shared his concern, his brow furrowed, his eyes dark and distant. Now all the mightiest the Horde had to offer gathered around him, echoing Rokan's sentiments. Already he heard someone say the word hero, and Zekhan shook his head. No, he wasn't a hero at all, just a boy from the jungles, from a village that would fit inside the gates of Orgrimmar 100 times over. He only wanted to make himself useful, not win some kind of accolade. Zekhan found Thrall's face among the throng again, but his expression went unchanged. The single black smudge in the otherwise cloudless sky, the distant warning presaging rain. Only a few would notice it. Only a few would take heed. But when the great leader worried, the wise warrior beneath him worried too. The Darkspear chieftain placed a hand on his shoulder, but Zekhan didn't smile. He trembled instead. Chapter 3, Dazar Alor. A hot, dry wind reached Talanji from the north, as if Vol'dun itself sighed towards her. She stood atop the great seal and inhaled as the breeze came, hoping to absorb the very essence of her home back into her body. This was where she belonged, the jungle, the vast golden city of her ancestors. Standing there was like standing at the edge of the world, nothing but verdant possibility and life stretching in every direction. On a clear night such as this one, she could see all the way to the tops of the mountains to the west, even above the temple of the prophet, to the peaks draped in emerald velvet. Home. Ziki removed Talanji's heavy ceremonial bracelets and rings one by one, collecting them in a box lined in fabric as soft-looking as those green mountains. With each removed piece, Talanji felt lighter, but also strange, vulnerable. For a moment she tore her eyes away from the jungle, and instead watched Ziki work with deft little hands. Those serving the royalty of Zandalar were trained to be all but invisible, to move on silent feet, to dress the royal body while barely being perceived. But she perceived the young troll then, her simple plaits of dark blue and sweet young face, unpierced, unscarred, untouched by time and suffering. Had Talanji ever been that innocent? Had she ever looked so serene? When Ziki finished, Talanji saw her close the box, set it down, and then unclasp the jade and jewel-encrusted surcoat the queen had worn to the gathering in Orgrimmar. She had then waited patiently for Talanji to pull the white satin shift over her head. "Go," Talanji told her. "I must be alone now." "My queen, your gown is stained." "Later. You are dismissed, Ziki." She didn't have to raise her voice. The young troll nodded and collected the queen's raiment, then disappeared into the throne room through the hidden servants' passage. Talanji turned her back on the jungles and mountains and retreated toward her throne. Sometimes, when she only glanced in its direction, she could still see the outline of her father, Rastakhan, seated there, his skin brightened by the ever-burning torches at his sides, his brooding eyes peering out beneath the weighty plumed crown on his head. But Rastakhan was gone, dead, murdered. Her hands turned immediately into fists as she approached the throne. When she was a child, Rastakhan sometimes let her sit on the massive chair, its sun-like spikes soaring high above her head. His warmth lingered on the cushions, as if he were actually part of the throne. She cringed, then shivered, the hot Vol'dun wind turning cold as daylight slipped away. They had departed Orgrimmar before anyone could convince her to stay, and while Talanji was grateful to be home, she couldn't escape the feeling that leaving the summit so soon was a mistake. Maybe if she had remained and pressed her case, the Horde Council would grant her reparations for Zandalar's people. That was all she could expect from the Horde, for their precious armistice meant too much to them, and justice for Rastakhan's murder would have to be found a different way. Instead, she had left Orgrimmar with nothing. No, not nothing, with fear in her heart and a black stain on her dress. Had that red-haired troll not blundered into the assassin and spilled the poisoned cup, she might be dead on the sands of Durotar, flies buzzing about her lips. "Bwonsamdi," she whispered, speaking the name of the Loa of Death. Her father, with his dying breath, had passed his cursed pact with the Loa onto his daughter, and now Talanji carried not only their bloodline, but their bane. A grey, curling fog drifted over her feet, colder than the changing night winds. That same mist filled the throne room, until at last she heard a familiar sound. Bwonsamdi had come, heralded by the strangled sigh of their realm, less a fanfare and more a dirge. The Loa of Graves hovered above the Zandalari throne, coils of blue smoke unfurling around him. A bony, skull-shaped growth covered most of his face, though his permanently smug smile remained unfettered. White tattoos glowed across his chest. Wild black hair piled on his head, spiky and stiff as a fern. "Oh," Bwonsamdi chuckled. "Oh, ho, ho, ho. The Queen is in distress. Why not unload your problems on your old friend Bwonsamdi?" Talanji crossed her arms. "I'm not in the mood, you old windbag. One of my own people tried to poison me, and he tried it in front of the Horde Council in broad daylight. My enemies are getting bold." "Ha ha! I nearly had your soul then. So is that why you summoned me?" He floated closer, and Talanji could see him batting his lashes like a fool behind his skull-like brow. "Thoughts of death made ya think of your best friend on the other side. How flattering, your majesty." No, Bwonsamdi. It's nothing like that," Talanji insisted, turning away with a grunt. "I want to speak to my father. You are the keeper of souls, the lord of death. Surely you must know where his soul resides. Can you not arrange an audience?" The Loa laughed uproariously, and the palace shook beneath her feet, rattled as if by thunder. He appeared above her, contorted, his face upside down as he came almost nose to nose with her. "What am I? Some servant to do whatever you bid? Think I keep your father in my back pocket? The spirit of a king is no trifle, girl." "Everything is a trifle to you," Talanji bit back, refusing to shrink. "Everything is a game." Bwonsamdi's smile faded. He sniffed loudly at her, snuffling like a hog. "Ya reek of death. It came close to ya, didn't it? Real close. Maybe you'll be wanting to ask your father what it's like on the other side." Talanji waved him off, marching forward and through the Loa, who popped out of sight. She returned to the balcony where the whole of her city and the jungles beyond waited. Hundreds of torches glittered as night approached, bright and curious, like a field of eyes staring up at her, needing her. No, I will find that out on my own terms, and no time soon. I ask as a queen who needs the counsel of her elder, nothing more, great spirit. Bring me the king, bring me his spirit, so that I might know his wisdom. I can do no such thing, girl. Bwonsamdi reappeared at her side, reclining against one of the large golden pillars crowned with a cauldron of fire. You don't control me, he reminded her, and I don't control you. Not according to my enemies, Talanji muttered. She hugged herself tighter. Half of Zandalar thinks I answer to you. If they keep thinking that way, I will never keep control. Pah! No wonder that assassin came for me today. I have my father's blood, his crown, his law, and now his rebels. If I can't be rid of them, my reign is as good as over. 'Tis now all doomin' and gloomin', Bwonsamdi said, gesturing to the large stain on her hem. Who do you think protected you today? You might show a little gratitude to your savior. Talanji snorted, shooting him a sideways glance. You cannot take credit for one troll's clumsiness. Bwonsamdi grinned, a twinkle in his eyes behind the mask like a bone around his orbit. I gave him a little shove, just a teensy one. But no action taken by the powerful is ever little, ye see. And now ye be learning what it really means to be powerful. Everyone always wanting something from ya, always asking, like ya be asking me now. That assassin wanted your death, but I wouldn't give it to him. And I won't give you your father neither. Unless... Bwonsamdi held on to the word until it sounded like the warning hiss of a snake. Unless what? Talanji snapped. Unless you be wanting to make a deal. It seems fair, no? I save your life, you make a deal with your friend Bwonsamdi. Talanji scoffed, pacing to the very edge of the terrace while the Loa's eyes burned into the back of her skull. To be bound to him was a curse, and she would thank him for nothing. And will you be there to give a little shove the next time? And the time after that? She sighed. There is unrest in my city, and the Horde will do nothing to stop it. They will not send me ships or troops. They will do nothing. The fate of Zandalar is in my hands. But how can I bring prosperity and peace to people who do not trust me? My father would know what to do. He always knew what to do. Or perhaps his Loa, Razan, would have known even better. Silence. The torches spat and flared. The watch changed below, and the clank of armor and footsteps rose up to meet them. The city, to her, seemed ominously quiet, just like her Loa. She expected a jab, a joke, some taunt meant to twist the knife of her doubts, but he simply stared at her. Either she was mad, or there was a flicker missing from his eyes then. He seemed dimmer, sad. What? She prodded. Nothing to say? Not a single sly word? That is not like you, Bwonsamdi. The Loa finally shook his head, and the mist that gathered at his feet grew thicker, obscuring him until only his strange blue flame eyes remained visible. Our bond is strong, little queen, but that does not make me your servant. I will not summon your father's spirit. I'm afraid you're on your own tonight.
Chapter 4. Nazmir. There was no shame in retreat. Sylvanas had taught him that. Retreat prevented outright failure, which Sylvanas had also made clear, along with her utter contempt for the concept. Nathanos Blightcaller spurred the winged lizard faster, digging his heels into its leathery sides and ignoring its pained shrieks. The Zandalari rebels who had gifted him the thing called it a Pterodax, but that mattered little. He only cared if it could fly fast enough to lose the patrol that had spotted him in Nazmir. The thing flew fast and reckless, and he closed a hand over his coat pocket again, making certain the vial was still there, that it hadn't tumbled out into the jungle canopy. Ah, there it was. He buttoned his pocket tighter just to be safe. Retreat. A familiar concept. It didn't irk him, but he was annoyed that the rebel leader Apari had been sloppy enough to miss the Zandalari patrol approaching their position. "Use only their own arrows," he shouted, the wind carrying his voice to the dark rangers flying in a V pattern behind him. Their aim proved true, and he watched the rain of brightly colored arrows descend with cruel precision, striking first one mounted Zandalari, and then another. 8 of the patrol remained, growing wise and ducking off the path, riding under the dense tree cover.
"We cannot allow them to reach the Banshee's wail," Sira called.
She had sprung ahead, but carefully reined in her beast, its wings slapping the air rhythmically as she waited for Nathanos to keep up.
"Allying with these rebels was a mistake."
Nathanos kept his head low, avoiding the sightlines of the ground patrol racing after them. "Go sharply south. The mountains are impassable on foot." The rangers escorting them east to the sea broke formation, diving down at breakneck speed towards the canopy. They wore the coarse, torn rags of jungle villagers, but even so, if any of the Zandalari patrol came near, they would surely see that these were not trolls fleeing toward the South Seas. "Blast!" Nathanos cursed, pulling his nondescript brown hood higher over his head. A beast, much like the one he rode, burst from the canopy, a spray of leaves fluttering in its path as it careened towards Lelius, the Dark Ranger to his right. The cursed Zandalari must have been druids, springing into a creature's form more fit for their pursuit. "Bring it down!" Nathanos bellowed. He pulled his own bow from his back and twisted in the saddle, risking recognition or, worse, an interminable tumble down to the rocky hills below. Lelius joined him in peppering the green-winged creature with arrows. Her hand blurred from the speed of her pull and fire, and at last 2 shots struck the Zandalari in the wings. It let out a piercing cry, then fell, its body shimmering strangely before reverting to its troll form, arrows prickling its shoulder. He lost sight of Lelius and the others, pouring his attention into reaching the beach with all haste.
"It's no use," Sira spat. "They're going to discover us."
"Never," Nathanos assured her. "The Queen's will must be done. Fly ahead, alert the crew, bring her around and into the bay, have archers at the ready."
"Take the ships to shore? Are you mad?"
"Just do as I say." Even under her hood and through the narrow slits in her helmet, Nathanos detected a flicker of resentment. Sira Moonwarden never enjoyed taking his barked orders. She never enjoyed anything, as far as he noticed. Sira did little but balk and glare at him, her willingness to follow orders contingent on a high enough body count to keep her satisfied. She raged at everything, at him, at her goddess Elune, at a world that had left her in isolating darkness. He knew the feeling, but had chosen to embrace it and grow stronger. What she had grown in, he could not say, but from what he had observed she had her anger and nothing else. He often found himself wondering if she was truly loyal to Sylvanas, or if her loyalty was simply to killing itself, and its way of distracting the mind, granting a heady, if fleeting, catharsis. After giving him one last glare, Sira did as he commanded, leaving him behind and sailing down in a remarkable spiral, becoming little more than a speck against the blue canvas of the sea, and farther on, the ship anchored far offshore.
Nathanos searched among the trees for the rangers, but both they and their assailants were running out of the jungle. Fighting in the open could be a mistake. If any of the Zandalari escaped, their plans would be in jeopardy. But this was their land, and they knew how to defend it. He doubted that they could best the Dark Rangers stationed on deck in a fair conflict. He pressed 2 fingers to his lips and gave 3 sharp whistles. The Dark Rangers gathered to him, reforming and leaving behind the skirmish in the trees. "We take them out in the open." Nathanos gestured to the beach below. "No survivors." It proved a quick, if messy, solution. The Zandalari, perhaps too committed and proud now to give up, did exactly as Nathanos expected. They raced out of their hiding places in the jungle, their raptor mounts eating up the sand quickly as they followed Nathanos and his escorts, taking the bait. Nathanos ducked down again, avoiding the occasional arrow that managed to zing near him. The Zuldazar jungle gave way to a sloped sandy hill, spotted with jagged rocks, a long stretch of open beach dividing the hills from the foamy shore. Hungry birds circled, expectant of a big meal, and Nathanos so hated to disappoint. "Slow down," he called to the riders, whistling again. "Draw them out." He watched the banshees wail, sails replaced with simple merchant's colours careen toward them, the long bowsprit bobbing gamely as the waves hit the boat with full force. Captain Delaria Dawes brought her around beautifully, the broad side of the purple-chased hull now near enough for the naked eye to see a dozen Dark Rangers perched on the railing, bows at the ready. "Land," he gave the order. "Fearless now. Let them think they have a chance." The 3 Dark Rangers with him obeyed at once, and together they hit the sand, then spun around to face the 7 riders bearing down on them, blood up, curved swords raised, their eyes aglow with the promise of battle. It was a promise that would never be fulfilled. They fell before coming in striking distance of Nathanos and the others. The trolls had taken the bait, and it doomed them. A storm of arrows arced over him and the other Dark Rangers, fired from the ship, landing in a deadly and precise cluster. He watched the trolls smash into the ground one by one, then dispatched Lelius to the Banshee's wail. "Tell Moonwarden of our victory here, and have the ship made ready to sail. We cannot anchor here again for a time," he explained. Lelius gave a sharp nod and kicked at her beast, soaring into the air and sprinkling them with a fine arc of sand. "Strip the bodies, recover the weapons, and put them into the sea. Make sure they are not found." He prepared to follow Lelius, trusting the Rangers to carry out his orders. "Remember, Rangers, we were never here. Fly north to find us when you are finished." On deck, Seera commanded things tidily, as he imagined she always did when he was absent. The Sky Terrors were seen to, fed, watered, and kept below deck for further inland incursions. "Adequate sailing as always. Now take us out," he told Captain Deliria, as he found his way quickly to the spacious great cabin at the stern. The captain snapped him a sharp salute, her long black hair whipped wildly by the sea winds. She stood taller than many of the other Rangers, with strong features and delicately arched brows. So far, serving with her on board had proved a tolerable experience. "That was close," Seera hissed, removing her helmet and shaking out her hair as she followed him through the ship's narrow corridors. "Much too close. I am beginning to think this Apari is not reliable. This might have been a trap." "I do not think so," Nathanos replied calmly. He shook the sand from his cloak and then plucked it off. It would take hours to get all the grit out of his coat and boots. "I looked her in her eyes, and the hatred I saw there is real. She wants to be rid of Talanji and the Horde as much as we do, and we cannot succeed here without her help." He opened the door to the cabin smoothly, but Seera appeared ready to kick it down. The Dark Warden stalked to the bright, mullioned windows and glared out at the waves. "We do not need a bunch of unorganized, desperate rebels." Seera slammed her helmet down on the banquet table, shaking the candelabra. One squadron of Dark Rangers is worth 200 farmers with pitchforks. She snatched off her gloves, examining her fingernails. I alone am worth twice that.
Your enthusiasm is appreciated, Sira, and noted. However, our task here does not just require precision, but utmost secrecy. Do you remember what I told you when we came aboard in Dragonblight?
She chewed over the question for a moment, then slumped into a chair. We were never in Zandalar.
Correct, Nathanos replied. He joined Sira at the long table, moving aside 2 chairs and taking a rolled parchment from a stack of them bundled at the center. Unrolling a map of the region, he smoothed it out carefully, removing the creases from each corner. We are not here right now. We will never be here. Their sloppiness is an asset. Chaos is an asset. Our new friends are the storm, and we are the single bolt of lightning that strikes. His forefinger landed in North Nazmir, leaving a smudge of dirt across a small rectangle and its accompanying label. The Necropolis. I still say my talents are better used elsewhere. Sira twisted and placed her forearms on the table, stacking them. Like at Windrunner's side, where the most killing is to be done. I have no taste for discretion. Only carnage will satisfy now. Nothing will ever satisfy, he thought. Such was the nature of undeath. But he forced himself to smile. Sira, you are greedy indeed if you consider the death of a god unsatisfying. Bonsamdi is the last aching thorn in our queen's side, and it is our job to pluck him out. He is powerful and irritatingly loyal to the Horde. We cannot know his plans, but we can assume he will use his knowledge of death against her, against us. Was it equal to an errand boy? Then she would have sent as much. Our queen has determined you will be served her best here, and it is not our place to ponder such decisions. Are you questioning my judgment? Sira growled, her red eyes burning with hotter fire. No, you are here, and in being here, you have not chosen an easy path, but the right one. We must save this world from itself, and that might require us to swallow the bitter with the sweet. I know you crave death, Sira, but you must deliver it here. Nathanos sat back, letting the map roll itself up and snap shut. If this is not suited to your talents, Sylvanas would not have chosen you. Sira blew out a long, tired breath. I will try to consider this mission as the opportunity for mayhem that it is. Still... Nathanos caught a sigh at the back of his throat. He needed Sira to accept her role in the Dark Lady's plans. He needed her focused and committed. Still, do you not think we should be at her side? Both the Alliance and the Horde hunt her, and if they should succeed in learning her whereabouts, they will not. She will triumph over them both, and why? Sira stared at him, silent, and yet she shifted forward ever so slightly. At least she was listening. Because the Alliance leaders do not trust each other. They are fractured and in disarray. And the Horde? The Horde will prove even less competent. So many voices, each with their own agenda, their own secrets and needs. Impossible. They will accomplish nothing. No, we are most useful here. That is her determination, and so we shall carry out her will. After a moment, Sira gave him a wry smile. Very well, Blightcaller. I am convinced. Good. See that you remain so. Bonsamdi is a menace and knows too much. Once he is dead and the Dark Lady's plans are in motion, there will be no more pain. We will be free of the cruelties of this world. He paused and watched the Dark Warden gather her helmet, standing and preparing to go. This is an honor, Sira. The Queen has so few loyal servants remaining. We, who still stand, must not disappoint her.
My goddess abandoned me. Sylvanus provides the succor of flesh and blood that will suffice, she said, pausing at the door. The ship swayed, the timbers creaking softly beneath the crash of the waves. For the moment. And then he was alone. Nathanos stood and crossed to the curved windows that looked out onto the sea. A chill passed through him as his thoughts drifted, as ever, to his dark queen. To be so far from her was almost a physical pain, as if the tether that bound them grew taut and frayed with distance. Every moment plucked at that string, straining it further. Nathanos closed his eyes, imagining the snow blowing in unforgiving white and silver drifts, a pair of bright crimson eyes piercing the storm. "I will not fail you," he whispered. A sharp knock came to the door, and he frowned, chiding himself for his sentimentality. Only the mission mattered, only the Queen's vision. "Enter." The candles hanging in the great cabin illuminated the soft, pale face of Vizerin as she bowed and then pulled back her hood. She was a Kaldorei Dark Ranger, the leaves tattooed on her face as crimson as her piercing eyes. "Ah, there you are. Were you spotted?" Nathanos had long awaited word from the ranger, and seeing her safely return put him more at ease. "I believe I traversed the highlands unseen," Vizerin replied smoothly. "You believe?" he scoffed, that ease tarnished. Examining her more closely, he noted a tattered and bloodied bandage around her left wrist. "Your belief is not satisfactory. There can be no mistakes, Vizerin. How exactly were you injured?" "I ran afoul of some beasts in the highlands. Nothing serious. I beseech you, Ranger Lord, there are more pressing matters. Lelius tells me word has come from the rebels." "And?" "Apari's plan has failed. Our spies report Queen Talanji has returned to the palace this night, though some report a large stain on her gown. She may have been injured in the assassination attempt." Nathanos refused to show his disappointment, though a single twitch in his jaw could not be stopped. For a moment he considered the most effective approach. They were already conspiring with rebels. Why not fan those flames hotter with the right misinformation? "Then come dawn, we have much to do. Gather the rangers, Vizerin, and contact our eyes in the city. Have them spread rumors that the Horde has lost faith in the Queen. Perhaps they are even seeking to usurp the kingdom for themselves. But we are not here to spread a campaign of truth," he snapped, whirling to face her. His fist fell with a deafening thump on the table. "We are here to create a campaign of fear. Let them doubt and debate. Let them panic. We will make this girl regret ever turning her back on the Banshee Queen."